All right, welcome back to Micro-Digressions. Had a very busy month and unfortunately missed last month's episode, but I'm happy to be back here with Matthew Adelstein to continue going up his list of arguments for the existence of God. Actually down on the page, because you have the better arguments at the bottom, but up because we're in ascending order from worst to best, in your opinion. I guess I wanted to ask this just general question about arguments for the existence of God, because there are many, obviously, as you know, there are many different kinds of arguments for the existence of God. And Chad McIntosh, who's also been a guest on this podcast, has advanced the argument from many arguments, like a kind of meta argument for the existence of God. So like the fact that there are so many different arguments itself is like evidence for the existence of God. They're sort of additive. And I'm wondering whether you think that's plausible, or maybe this other thing might be true. I was thinking this today, which is that if you have a lot of different arguments for the existence of God, but theists don't agree on which ones are the good ones, so there's like a broad range of opinion as far as what arguments are good. Like some go for the ontological argument, some think it's crap. That I think weakens the argument or the meta argument, right? Because it seems like you should expect some kind of convergence around the arguments that are good. And if you have many people believing in God for many different reasons, that sort of suggests that, well, maybe it's the conclusion that's driving the arguments and not the other way around.
So I think there is an element of truth to what both you and Chad are saying, and a partial element of it which is wrong. Regarding what you said first, it's true that if there's lots of disagreement about arguments, it might be because none of them are good, but it might also be because people are generally not very good at discerning good philosophical arguments. So I think you'll find similar things for moral realists. If you ask philosophers which arguments for moral realism are good, you'll get a fair degree of convergence. But if you ask non-philosophers, you'll get just a variety of different things they'll say in defense of moral realism to the extent they accept it that don't make any sense. So I don't think it's that surprising that non-philosophers, that there's a variety of disagreement among people who I think are sort of, the philosophers who I think are most consistently correct, even just on matters outside of philosophy of religion. There tends to be quite a lot of convergence. So, my tier list is very similar to the tier list that Joe Schmidt would have, or that Dustin Crummett would have, or that Daniel Rubio had when he and Joe did a tier list for God. There actually is a surprising degree of convergence. Regarding what Chad said, I think Chad gets to very high numbers of arguments for theism by really just double counting. So he'll have, 15 subtly different variants of cosmological arguments. Count them as 15 different arguments. Now, obviously, they don't have anything like independent evidential force. So conditional, if the first one's wrong, the odds any of the rest are right is very low. So for that reason, I tend to think that the project of just trying to stack up a very large list of arguments for God, it's not that persuasive. Now, where there's an element of truth to it is that I think that of the arguments that are actually significantly forceful, I think that there are more on the theist side than on the atheist side. I think basically the atheist only has one really compelling argument, which is some broad variation of the problem of evil. I think once you have in the background the fact that the world is filled with evil, that you also have a perfectly fine explanation of divine hiddenness. So whatever it is that explains why there's malaria, torture, flesh-eating parasites, and cancer will probably also explain why some people are ignorant of the existence of God for some of their lives. So I think there are quite a few different arguments for theism that have a decent amount of force, as we'll see. Well, I think of the arguments for atheism, there's really only one that has significant force. There are a few others that pose small problems, that pose sort of minor puzzles, but I think overall the theist has the majority of the really powerful arguments.
I agree with you that the argument from evil is really the atheist's best argument. The argument from divine hiddenness, I kind of think that really is probably best construed as a form of the argument from evil, where God's hiddenness is a form of evil or something like that. And I guess you've got these puzzles about divine attributes that, I don't know. I mean, they're maybe troublesome for the theist, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that would make anybody an atheist. So basically, I think the way we should think about the arguments for the existence of God is they have to together be more compelling than whatever the best argument from evil is. Like, that's what determines whether the theist wins or loses the debate in the end. What do you think?
I basically agree. I mean, there are a few other sort of small considerations. So in theory, it could be that, like, you might think that theism has a low prior or something. And so think even putting aside the problem of evil, the theistic arguments aren't enough to overcome the low prior combined with the problem of evil. But I basically agree that I think whether you're a theist should basically come down to whether you think the Bayes factor of all the different theistic arguments is greater than the Bayes factor of the problem of evil. Once you accept that, I think it's pretty smooth sailing to be a theist, because the odds that we're just mistaken about the problem of evil aren't that high. Aren't that low. I agree, evil is a strong argument, but I've been wrong before. It wouldn't be that shocking if I turned out to be misunderstanding something that makes the problem of evil ultimately not decisive. In contrast with the argument for theism, I think for atheism to be right, there are lots of different things we'd have to be wrong about. While with theism, it's only we're wrong about the problem of evil. And so the evidence for theism strikes me as more like the evidence for evolution, where you have lots of different converging lines of evidence. And so if you have many different converging lines of evidence, and then on the other side, you just have one big consideration, I tend to think the many different converging lines of evidence will be more decisive than the one big consideration on the other side.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. So we left off with miracles, the argument for miracles, which ranked C on your tier of arguments. I wanted to follow up on that because there's one thing we didn't talk about with miracles, which is the Christianity argument, the argument that says there's historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that is evidence for the existence of God. That's interesting because it's not just from miracles in general, but it's from one particular claim. And I think it's true that, like, if the resurrection really did happen, that's evidence for the existence of God in a way that, like, the Zaytun stuff wouldn't be. That seems right. I guess my thought is there is something interesting going on there with the foundations of Christianity, because it's not obvious what the true skeptical hypothesis would be, assuming that the resurrection didn't happen. Like, did Jesus survive the crucifixion and think he was resurrected? Was there some kind of imposter who had self-inflicted wounds who managed to fool everybody? Like, whatever happened there was weird, assuming that it was a skeptical hypothesis. So I think there's maybe some evidentiary value there, but it's not enough to convince me that, like, oh yeah, it's reasonable to think that the resurrection is, like, the best explanation for all of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm still thinking through the evidence for Christianity, but yeah, I think definitely something weird happened, where something pretty surprising happened, where many of Jesus's early followers thought they saw him after he died. Maybe his tomb was found empty. I'm not as sure about that, but I think it's plausible. James, his skeptical brother, converted, and Paul, a big persecutor of the church, converted after having an appearance of the risen Jesus. And so, an analogy that my friend Aaron Wall has given is, he says this would be like if Hitler had a vision that caused him to denounce his Nazism, and then he became a well-respected Jewish rabbi. That would be a pretty surprising event. So in any case, I think you'll have to think something weird happened. On the other hand, when weird things happen, that seems disproportionately likely to start religions. Weird things do happen sometimes. So ultimately, I don't find the evidence to be it's not nothing, but it's not enough to make me a Christian, at least not yet.
So ascending up into the B tier, one of the things you had in the B tier was the argument from contingency. You want to walk us through that one?
Yeah, so the argument from contingency claims that there are certain contingent things. Contingent things are things that could have been otherwise. So, like, I'm contingent. Had my parents not had me, I wouldn't have existed. The table behind you is contingent. Most things in the world are contingent. It says if there's something that's contingent where it could have been otherwise, it seems like you need an explanation for why that thing rather than something else. So the idea is if you have a contingent thing, something else needs to bring it about. Well, then what brings about that contingent thing? And so the idea is that from this chain of contingent things, there has to be a first necessary thing. So there has to be some necessary thing to bring about the contingent things. And then this first necessary thing, they'll argue, has various defined attributes. Now, you might wonder, okay, why think there has to be a first necessary thing rather than just an infinite chain? I think the answer there is that an infinite chain itself, the chain itself is contingent. So even if you have an explanation of each member of the chain, you don't have an explanation of the chain itself. So as an analogy, suppose that there's a ball and it just at one point for no reason starts moving. Seems like something unexplained happened. But suppose a person were to say, well, no, nothing's unexplained. For any time t, the ball's movement at time t is explained by its movement at t/2. Its movement at 1 second is explained by its movement at half a second.
This is what Hume says, I think, right? In his dialogues concerning natural religion, I think, right? I think he's responding indirectly to Samuel Clarke. He says something like, look, each item in the sequence has an explanation. That's all you need. You don't need the entire chain to have some external explanation.
Yeah, I don't know if Hume said that, but I think that sounds right. Or, another case is, think about a circular explanation. So where A explains B and B explains A. Imagine there were two magical mice that just appeared. And then you say, oh, well, each individual mouse is explained by the simultaneous appearing of the other one, who simultaneous with their existence casts a spell to create the other one. Seems like something's unexplained. Where even though you have an explanation for each member of the sequence, you don't have an explanation for the entire sequence. It seems like each one gets explanatory powers from existing, but if it seems like you don't have an ultimate explanation for why there's the existing thing in the first place. Okay, so you might think, okay, so for that reason, I think an infinite causal chain would still be basically unexplained. Okay, and so now lots of people they're on board so far. They say there's a necessary first thing, but they're unwilling to grant that the necessary first thing is God or bears any significantly godlike characteristics. So there are a few different reasons to think that the first thing might be God. One reason is that if you don't think that the first thing is God, then that has fairly counterintuitive implications for modal facts. Modal facts are facts about what's possible and necessary. So, for example, the fact that married bachelors are impossible, that's a modal fact. The fact that different laws of physics are, though non-actual, possible, that's a modal fact. Okay, so there are lots of ordinary modal facts we make, like there could have been Newtonian laws. That seems like a modal fact. But if we think that things need an explanation for there to be Newtonian laws, well, something would have to explain it. And so whatever the first thing is, the necessary thing that explains the other stuff, if Newtonian laws are possible, that thing has to be able to be brought to bring about Newtonian laws. Otherwise, where could the Newtonian laws ever come from? And so if you think that Newtonian laws are for any world that's possible, you'll think that the initial thing is capable of bringing it about. But then it seems like, well, the initial thing can bring about all possible things. Now, we could radically restrict your account of modality. So you could say, maybe there's just one possible initial state of the world, and so it can do all possible things, but there's only one possible state. But so long as you have a fairly expansive modal picture on which there are lots of different things that are possible, it's going to look, pretty it looks like the first thing will be omnipotent. The other thing is, God seems to be a better candidate for being the first thing, both because he doesn't have any arbitrary limits and is self-explanatory. So there are plausible, there are some ways that theists have attempted to show that God might just exist as a result of logic. There might be reasons why he couldn't not exist, why it just follows from his nature or something. Well, it's much less plausible that, like, the universe, that there's some story about how the universe just exists. And then lastly, it seems like for the first thing, if there's something that's self-explanatory, it'd seem really weird if it had a limit, like if there was a thing that just necessarily existed, but there was just some arbitrary limit. But God, he's traditionally conceived of as to have just one fundamental property, like goodness or consciousness or something that's just wholly unlimited. And so for that reason, you'd think the first thing maybe will lack limits. Now, all that said, I'm not a big fan of the contingency argument. I think I gave it B tier. These days, I'd maybe give it lower than B tier. I don't even think God's necessary. So I think if we think about all the other things that are necessary, you could figure out that they exist just from the armchair, merely by thinking about them. So, just by thinking about it, you could figure out the moral facts. You could figure out that married bachelors are impossible. It doesn't seem like just from the armchair, you could just figure out that certainly God exists necessarily. So for that reason, I think that that's a reason to think God can't be necessary, to think that no concrete thing can be necessary. And then I think even if we grant there's a necessary being, I'm not sold on it having to be godlike. I think the last point about no arbitrary limits has some force, but I think that's just kind of a different argument, that the foundation of reality being arbitrarily limited is really weird. And then on the last point, I agree with God does seem to have a better status as the first thing, because he seems to have a more plausible story for being self-explanatory than the other things. So there, I think it would raise the probability of theism. I don't think that consideration super decisive. There are various other stories about what the initial first thing are that seem to equally not need an explanation. Like if you're a modal realist and you just think all the possible worlds are equally real, that also seems like the plurality of worlds could be equally self-explanatory. So for all those reasons, I don't think the contingency argument has no force, but I'm not very convinced.
Yeah, so there's also, it could be the case that there are no actual contingent beings. Everything could be necessary. We could be modal fictionalists or something like that. It's another way of resisting this. You have to accept the category of contingent beings. I guess that's another way you could go resisting it. But what do you think about the infinite regress, the anti-regress part of the argument? Given that there are contingent beings, you feel good about the part of the argument that says there can't be an infinite regress of such beings? Or
so I think if an infinite regress wouldn't be self-explanatory. So for that reason, I think an infinite regress, like, either would itself be a brute fact or need to be explained by something else. On whether an infinite regress is metaphysically impossible, I'm not sure. I'm very conflicted about it. There are, Alexander Proust has a book arguing for causal finitism. Joe Schmid has a bunch of replies. I'm ultimately not so sure what I think about all this. It ends up getting very complicated. But I certainly am not confident enough in that premise to hang a theistic argument on it.
I wonder if there's something in the neighborhood of this argument, which is that with God, you have fewer brute facts, right? Because if you've got something existing necessarily, that explains everything, that's a brute fact. But if it's just you've got an initial state of the universe that that's just a brute fact, maybe that is a check mark against a theory to have that. Or especially if you've got an infinite regress of brute facts or something.
I guess I wouldn't. If you have an infinite number of brute facts, that seems bad. But I think generally you want each fact, each member of the chain explains the next. So you don't have infinite brute facts. You just have one brute fact
about the chain.
Yeah. Because each member is explained.
Right. I guess that's fair.
I do find the. One reason to think maybe infinite causal chains are impossible is intuitively, it does seem like if you explain every member of a set, you've explained the set. That doesn't seem to hold with infinite causal chains. So that's one reason to think maybe they're just impossible, so that way you would get to hold on to the initial intuition. Because, principles don't have to apply to impossible things. Yeah, it's pretty hard to know. Though I tend to think if an argument requires going a particular way on lots of very hard to figure out issues, That's a pretty big defect of the argument. And that's how I feel about the contingency argument, where I feel this way about a lot of cosmological arguments, where I feel like there are lots of different moving parts. While with some of the arguments we'll talk about later, basically all the premises I think are pretty uncontroversial. I mean, there are people who reject them, but I don't think there are good reasons to reject them. I don't think they mostly don't require like staking out a position on several different like contentious philosophical topics.
Moving along to consciousness. So how is the existence of consciousness an argument for the existence of God?
Okay, so here's one fact about consciousness. It's very good. In fact, it is probably a prerequisite for anything being good. At the very least, it's a prerequisite for most of the value in the world. If there's a God, I think it's very likely that there would be consciousness. It's the single like most important feature of flourishing in the world. So it's the odds of there being consciousness given theism are roughly 1. In contrast, given atheism, the odds are very low, I think. First of all, I think there are powerful arguments for a position known as dualism, where dualism says that consciousness that consciousness doesn't reduce to anything physical. So that consciousness and the physical world are separate and distinct, that no amount of arranging atoms in particular ways will ever by itself suffice to get you consciousness. If dualism's right, which I think it is, then you need special laws that govern the rise of consciousness in order for there to be any consciousness at all. Now, I think there are these laws, but these are called psychophysical laws. But the existence of psychophysical laws is much better explained by theism than by atheism. If you think that there are fundamental laws that only kick in at the higher level and that happen to give rise to the single most valuable thing in the world, that's much more expected on theism than on atheism. Especially because just consciousness, it's a very different sort of thing from everything else in the universe, and so it's quite suspicious on atheism that a broadly materialistic, naturalistic world would have experiences kick in 10 billion years after the universe began. Now, what if you are a physicalist? What if you think that everything's physical? Well, then I still think the argument is some evidence for theism, for the following 2 reasons. First of all, even if you think that there are some physical states that give rise to mental states, on atheism, there's no guarantee that those physical states would ever exist. So, on atheism, there's no reason to expect whatever physical states happen to give rise to consciousness to ever exist in the universe. While theism does give a reason to expect that. Second of all, even it can be that your theory says that something is necessary, and also that the thing is surprising given your theory, right? So imagine we have 2 theories. Imagine there's some website that writes down digits of pi. The first theory is that this is a legitimate catalog of the digits of pi. And the second theory is that this isn't really the digits of pi. Really, the guy just loves the number 5, so he sort of pretends at the beginning for it to be digits of pi, and then fills it almost entirely with the number 5. Now, suppose you sample, and these theories, suppose you sample, number, 600,000 on the list, and surprise, the number is 5. That would give you evidence for the theory that he's, monkeying with the numbers, even though on the alternative theory, it being 5 is necessary. Because the point is, even if that's necessary, it's surprising. Like, you're surprised to learn that it's necessary. And so it'll require a more improbable thing to happen. So the broad takeaway is things can be surprising on a theory and yet can nonetheless be necessary given the theory. If that's right, well, certainly consciousness is very surprising even given physicalism. If all you knew was that, there was a physical world and, eventually, brains came together and, did various things, you would not expect at all for them to ever give rise to consciousness. You would not expect, these brains, to just naturally produce consciousness. So for that reason, I think even if you're a physicalist, the emergence of consciousness is very surprising. And so it's evidence for theism over atheism because it's surprising and valuable. If there's a feature that's surprising and valuable, then it's evidence for theism because the likelihood that God would create it is higher than the likelihood that it would be created by atheism, or that by an atheistic world, to be more exact.
Okay, so I think I accept that consciousness is necessary for there to be value in the world. I don't think all value is a matter of conscious states. I'm not a hedonist or an experientialist, but I do think that, if you don't have anything consciousness in the universe, you don't have any value in the universe. But it's also necessary for disvalue, I think, in the same way, right? So why doesn't the value and the disvalue of consciousness just cancel itself out? Like, it's possible God would have just not created at all to avoid creating suffering, for example. So I don't even know that theism does predict consciousness. And furthermore, I don't know that atheism doesn't predict it. It might just be, or atheism predicts the absence of consciousness. I think there's something weird about treating atheism as like a complete worldview that you're holding up against theism and comparing them probabilistically in this way, because presumably it's not just atheism that's going to be the alternative. It's going to be a kind of naturalism that assumes the existence of a certain kind of world, and that world is going to be a world that has consciousness in it. So
right. So you can always build the phenomenon into your theory, right? So you can build into your kind of naturalism that it has consciousness, and then rather than being evidence against your theory, it'll just lower the prior of the theory. But at least it raises the likelihood that there's a God, because by eliminating many of the theories on which there's no God, for many of those theories don't have any consciousness, and on many of those theories, it's surprising that there is consciousness. I think it'll still be evidence against kind of bare naturalism, where everything is physical, because on this bare naturalism, the existence of consciousness is very unexpected. Now, regarding the earlier point, I think theism does predict that God would create, because it's good to create. And God's perfectly good, and he has no limit to his ability to create. So there's nothing stopping him from creating. So you can just get extra value for free. So it's hard to see why he wouldn't do that. And then you say, well, consciousness is also required for disvalue, and I agree that disvaluable states of consciousness are evidence against theism. But that's just, at that point, you're just making the problem of evil. I'm saying we would expect consciousness to exist on theism. Then once we take into account more specific facts about consciousness, like the fact that there's lots of conscious suffering, that I think is evidence. Again, I'll grant that's evidence against theism, but I'm saying just the mere existence of consciousness is evidence for theism. One way to see this is, imagine you have two atheists and two theists, two atheist and theist angels, okay? Or sorry, one atheist angel and one theist angel. And these people, they're they're talking about whether consciousness will exist, 3 billion years after the start of the universe, like long before there's any life. The theist angel says, well, of course, God's good, so he'll make consciousness. Consciousness is this, a prerequisite for anything to be good. And the atheist angel says, well, I don't think there's any consciousness. It's a really weird thing. It's very surprising that there's any we wouldn't expect this world of just clumps of matter moving together to give rise to a subjective private experience. Now, the theist angel would have been right, and the atheist angel would have been wrong.
The weird thing about this thought experiment is you have to imagine something with consciousness there making the prediction to begin with, right?
Yeah. Well, so you're supposed to imagine in cases like this, and it works similar things when you're assigning priors in other ways. You're supposed to imagine that the creature doesn't consider the facts of its own situation. So it never occurs to them to think about the fact that they're conscious, because otherwise their credences get screwed up. Because what you want to figure out is how reasonable it would be on the mere assumption of atheism that there would be consciousness, not on the mere assumption of atheism if you happen to be a conscious creature.
So I don't know that the argument you gave that God would create is airtight, because yes, you'd say God is good. You'd expect something good to want to bring value into the world. So you'd expect God to create a world with consciousness in it. But if God is already infinitely good, like his value is infinite already, and the highest order of infinity or whatever, it's not like he's adding value to the universe and creating. Like he's already maxed out the value. So that seems like
I think this is the wrong way of thinking about it. So let me first give an example from that John Buck's given. Imagine the worst conceivable being, an anti-god of sorts. So this being is just maximally horrible. Its existence is, horrible to the max. And then ask, suppose this being could, with the snap of its fingers, create quadrillions of people being tortured all the time. Seems like it would do that because it's maximally terrible. But you could similarly say, well, no, it's already maximally bad, so it's not adding badness to the world. I think the mistake is assuming that if two worlds have the same infinite, cardinality of badness, then one can't have extra badness. Even if one world is just the other one with the addition of extra badness. So similarly with theism, I think if you take an infinitely good world and then strictly add more good stuff to it, even though it still has infinite positive value and the cardinality is the same, you've made it better in that it's better in at least one respect and worse in no respects. This is also why if we discover that there's an infinite multiverse with infinite positive aggregate utility, this wouldn't mean, nothing we do can be good on grounds that, the world's already infinitely good, because we can still add more good stuff to the world. What matters is what matters is not the size of the ocean, but the size of the drop or something. Now that's in a slightly different context, but I think that's true. What matters is not the total amount of good that there is after you've brought about good. It's what matters is the good that you bring to the world.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe if there were an infinitely evil, awful being who already added negative, infinite utility to the world or something. I don't know. Maybe that there'd be no point in that being creating either. So I see the intuitive force of that.
Spencer, really, really vividly imagine the scenario. Okay, imagine this being is thinking about whether to create a quadrillion people, all of whom they'll just be tortured for their entire lives. Their entire lives will just consist of the most brutal torture imaginable. They'll be burned alive, the most horrible things happening. And then we ask, would it be bad if that happened? I think it's super obvious that the answer is, yeah, that would be a terrible thing, because even though it was already infinitely bad, you've added this additional source of very large amounts of badness.
I'm supposed to be imagining it in a world that's already got infinite negative utility. I don't know that I trust my intuitions about cases like that.
Right. So, one intuition that I have is that if you want to figure out if some state of affairs, if the addition of a state of affairs, how significant it is, you don't need to know what's happening in causally isolated pockets of reality. So if you want to know if it's good for some improvement to happen, if you want to figure out if it's good to, do for something bad to happen in a cave, you don't need to know what's happening, galaxies outside of the cave, light years away. But if that's right, then, the creature would be very likely, adding extra misery is always bad, even if the world is still infinitely bad or infinitely good, whether or not the extra misery occurs.
You're depriving yourself of a resource for resisting the argument from evil here, right? Because if God has infinite utility, or there are infinite number of angels or an infinite number of happy beings, then that could just swamp the evil, and But yeah. I digress.
Yeah, but I don't think that's a very plausible theodicy, because I think that even if you think that, I don't find the substantive ethical claim very plausible. And then even if it's right, it might explain God, it not really mattering what he does. But it's very surprising that you get the mix of evils that's similar to what you get on atheism, namely just this sort of blind turning out of evils of the sort that you'd get from atheistic indifferent natural laws. So it would still be evidence against theism, but.
All right, but you still only give this one A-. Why do you give this one only A-?
I don't know. That's how much force it felt like it had to me. I think it has, a sizable amount of force, but it's not a one-shot knockout of atheism.
Okay. So let's move on, see what else we have here. We're moving on to the solidly A arguments, I think, now.
This one could have been A, like,
Could have been A.
rather than A minus. I don't like, these rankings. They're not a highly precise science. Like, I feel like, this one, it has a lot of force. Exactly how much force, exactly how you want to rank it. Okay, hard to know exactly.
Okay. So next up, you've got nomological harmony. Is this the same thing as the fine-tuning argument, or?
No,
it's not. Okay, how is it different?
I mean, it's just a totally different argument. So the idea of nomological harmony is this argument. There was a long paper on it by Brad Sad, I think is his name, and Brian Cutter. The basic idea is consider, so there are laws, and the laws will say, all x's do y. So all things with mass attract. Okay, but you could imagine the laws say all x's do y, but they're just not being any x's. They're instead being z's. So the laws are such that if there were any x's, they would do y. They're just no x's to be seen. So if this is right, then it seems like a pretty big coincidence that the laws that we have happen to line up with the things that are in the universe. An analogy that I think they gave in the paper is, imagine you discovered that you came across some random set of pieces, and you came across a random rule book. And it just happened that the rule book precisely matched with the pieces so that it described a perfectly functioning game. At that point, you'd assume, well, probably an agent was behind this. Probably this wasn't just pieces being thrown together and a rule book being thrown together at random. Probably an agent was behind matching this. You should think, I think, a similar thing about nomological harmony. So that's the basic idea of the argument. Now, you might wonder, okay, maybe that there are different accounts of laws. One account of laws that people have is they have a governing account of laws, where they say laws are these things that they're sort of like a rule book that goes over the universe and it governs what it does. So, there's the law of gravity, which governs the universe and makes it so everything with mass attracts according to the inverse square law. But then there are other accounts of laws. So one of the other accounts of laws is laws are just like powers. So saying there's a law of gravity just means everything with mass has the power to attract other stuff. So that might seem to get out of the argument. After all, if you have, it's no surprise that things have the powers that they do, that match up with other things. But the thing Cutter and Sad point out is there's a parallel problem here, where things that have powers, they'll have powers that have certain counterfactual conditions. So, things have the power to attract other stuff with mass. But this power doesn't do anything if there are no things with mass. So it's coincidental that the powers that each of the things have are matched up with the other stuff that exists so that you get complicated interactions. Now, there's the third view of laws called humanism. Humanism basically says that really just stuff happens and laws serve as summaries of the stuff that happens. Now, I think humanism is a kind of bad view. But even if you buy humanism, I don't know if the argument works. There was a while when I thought it did, and because my rationale was, even if you think that really just stuff happens, well, stuff happens. What stuff happens depends on certain counterfactual conditions. So it's surprising that the counterfactual conditions under which stuff happens actually arise. But I had a conversation with Joe Schmid and separately with Daniel Rubio about this, and neither of them seemed to think it worked, and they both understand humanism better than I did, and I didn't really get what they were saying. So take this particular insight with a grain of salt, but I think it might still work on humanism. But so in any case, I think there's a fairly powerful argument from, if you're not a human, at least, then I think there's a fairly powerful argument for theism, and especially if you have a governing view of laws.
Okay, I do think, although this is distinct from the fine-tuned argument, maybe some of the same considerations to say in response to the fine-tuning argument will bear on this. So I will withhold my criticisms for now of this one. And I'm going to proceed up. Now we have, you give this A plus for moral knowledge. I think this is mostly an argument for a priori knowledge, right? Like it not.
Yeah, it's more broadly from a priori knowledge rather than just being about moral knowledge.
Okay, tell us how this one goes.
Okay, so the basic idea is, and the exact details are a bit more complicated, and will get a little more intricate when you get into other kinds of knowledge other than just moral knowledge, but like the kind of knowledge needed for induction, for instance. But so just for a simplifying assumption, let's just grant moral realism of the non-naturalist variety. So there's a very plausible principle about knowledge, which is, suppose you have an experience that you think, justifies your belief, some belief. Like, I see what appears to me to be a table. And so I conclude that there is a table. And then I learn, actually, my experience of the table is not explained at all by the existence of the table. I would have had exactly the same experiences, even if the table had never been there. So assume, for instance, that I'm hallucinating a table. So maybe a table is actually there, but I would have seen the table regardless of whether it was there. Well, then I don't have justification for thinking there's a table. Okay, so now consider our moral beliefs. Well, all of our moral beliefs are based either directly on intuitions or are derived from some other source of intuition. So maybe you think torture is wrong, and you think that because it hurts people, okay, and so that'll be derived from other intuition. So ultimately, all of our moral beliefs will bottom out at intuition. But then those intuitions on the broadly naturalist picture of the world are not at all explained by the facts they're about. The fact that torture is wrong isn't the sort of thing that can move around atoms. Had the moral fact been different per impossible, our moral beliefs would have been the same. The evolutionary picture about how we came about our moral beliefs does not make any reference to the fact that they're true. And so for that reason, I think if our moral beliefs are true, it would be a pretty surprising coincidence on atheism. So when you combine these, we certainly know, I think it's very clear we know things about morality. We know that it's wrong to torture babies. We know that it's wrong to torture babies, and this fact doesn't depend on what people think about it. I know that by saying this, we're going to invite a long blog comment from Lance Bush, but that's okay. I think we know all sorts of things about morality, and similar points will apply to other kinds of a priori knowledge, like knowledge that say a world that's exactly like ours, where the laws continue in the same way they've been before, is likelier than one in which the laws radically diverge from how they've been before. But so I think we know things about morality. Theism explains why we would have the faculties that teach us that allow us to know stuff about morality and induction and so on. And so it's better explained by theism than by atheism.
Yeah, I don't like this one. I don't like this one at all. It's just there does seem to be like a whole genre of arguments for theism that are like this, which is just taking some kind of skeptical argument and then, I guess this argument is so powerful. We need a divine bailout to get us past it, and then invoking God for that purpose. Not into it, not finding it plausible, If you think we really have this moral knowledge, then you must think that a priori knowledge is possible. I don't know why you would think that God is the only way it could be possible. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't think God is the only way it could be possible. I think really what you need for us to have a priori knowledge is you need there to be some faculty by which we directly grasp facts that are not about the physical world, so like moral facts and mathematical facts, where the facts themselves play an explanatory role in our beliefs about them. So that's really what you need. But then I think us having such faculties just is better explained by theism than by atheism. That on theism, you'd expect us to be these kinds of rational creatures that can grasp these facts. That's very valuable. On atheism, it's quite a bit more surprising, especially if you think like, there have to be special laws that allow us to grasp these facts. Regarding the other point, it's not so much that there's like a skeptical argument. Were I to be an atheist, I would be a moral realist. I just think that there's some feature of the world that we need to invoke to get out of a skeptical argument. And then that feature of the world is better explained by theism than by atheism. Now you were saying, well, if you buy this argument, why would the atheist be a moral realist or something? If you think that there's a convincing skeptical argument. But I think you can think the following two things. You can think, number one, it's really obvious that it's wrong to torture babies. And so you think, look, we know that it's wrong to torture babies. But on the other hand, that we know that it's wrong to torture babies is fairly mysterious, and say that theism gives a better explanation of that fact. And so if you're an atheist, you'd still have to settle for thinking it's wrong to torture babies and go for the less good explanation of that. But just think theism has a better explanation of how we come to know that it's wrong to torture babies.
Okay. And to be clear, not that you're confused about this, but just to be clear for the audience, this is not about why that it is wrong to torture babies. It's that we're beings capable of knowing that is theism.
And also for the audience, I guess, when you make any argument that says anything about morality and says anything about atheism, people say, "Oh, so you're saying atheists can't be moral?" That is not what I'm saying. That's not in the same universe as what I'm saying. The argument is about theism best explaining how we have the capacities that allow us to discern moral facts.
Okay, that variation of the argument seems more plausible to me. I guess I'll grant that. It's fortunate that we're able to discern moral facts, and that would be more expected on theism. I guess some kind of alternative naturalism that was atheistic. So I guess I see some sort of force to that. Now I take it that the anti-skeptical argument is similar in spirit. Is that right?
Yeah, the anti-skeptical argument, it's a bit different, but I mean, the basic idea is, look, there are lots of ways. So let's grant that we know we're not in a skeptical scenario, which I think we do. There are lots of ways we could have found ourselves in skeptical scenarios. We could have been Boltzmann brains. We could have been brains in vats. We could have been in an infinite universe, which I think most infinite universes actually, like, by default, undermine the reliability of irrational faculties. There have to be special conditions met for them to not undermine induction. We could have been, there are a whole range. The Boltzmann brain ones are probably the most troubling, because for every Boltzmann brain, like there are lots of kind of simple models of physics that just give rise to infinite Boltzmann brains and finite non-Boltzmann brains. Entropy tends to grow over time. And so if entropy continually grows, then you'll get an infinitely long period that proliferates Boltzmann brains, and only a finite period where you don't. So yeah, Boltzmann brains seems like they're pretty numerous. And the point is, so we know that there are a whole range of ways that there could have been ubiquitous skeptical scenarios, but none of these are the case. We have generally reliable knowledge. We live for a long time and so on. So God wouldn't want to put us in a skeptical scenario, but I think atheism makes it quite a bit more likely that we'd be in a skeptical scenario than theism. I think this is especially so if you think the universe is infinite, that you actually have to set parameters in weird ways to not get a skeptical scenario if the world is infinite. So overall, I think this argument, I think it has a decent amount of force. Maybe I'd put this one a little bit below the last one, but I don't know how they're. I sort of fluctuate about how I feel about the various arguments, but I think it certainly has a decent amount of force.
Can't we just reason to the thought that we're probably not in a skeptical scenario? So consider the simulation argument or the brain in a vat. In order for there to be a simulation, there has to be a reality on which the simulation is like parasitic. Otherwise, the simulation just is reality, and you don't actually get a skeptical scenario. So the chances that we're in a skeptical scenario seem like they're smaller than the chances that we're not, just based on that.
Yeah, so I agree that the odds that we're in a skeptical scenario are low. What I'm saying is you want, the best explanation. You want to look for the best explanation that we're not in a skeptical scenario. So as an analogy, I'm very confident that there's life, okay? But you could still point to life as evidence for theism, because the point is, well, we know this thing's real. It's not saying that atheism implies that there's no life. It's just saying theism better explains why there's life. Now, in turn, I would agree. I think the simulations probably would not lead to skeptical scenarios. I don't think simulations are super likely, and even if they were actual, then I think probably we would not be in skeptical scenarios on the simulation hypothesis. But I think there are some other ones that are more troubling. One that I remembered I wrote down is it does seem like each of the main theories of anthropics, just by default, when conjoined with atheism, leads to skepticism. So there are three main theories of anthropics. I won't go into detail about how they each imply skepticism when conjoined with atheism, as it would get kind of technical. But I mean, you can check it out in the article if you want. But yeah, so for that reason, I think atheism, when conjoined with whatever constraints the right anthropic theory imposes on us, makes skepticism very likely. And so if we happen to avoid skepticism, that's a miracle. And who could perform miracles but God?
Okay, I don't know. I'm not feeling myself overwhelmed by that, but okay, let's move on. Now we're into the A tier, right? Or no, S tier.
S tier.
S tier. Why S tier? It's something even better than the A tier.
I think this is how tier lists tend to work. I didn't invent it.
I've never heard of an S tier before.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think tier lists tend to be like I think there's very standardly S tiers on tier lists. But I think it's more of a Gen Z and below thing. So maybe that would partially explain you're not having heard of it.
Oh yeah, I'm not risen with that or whatever it is you kids say. Okay, so these are the ones so good that they ought to convince you all by themselves. I think, right?
I don't know if they'd ought to convince you all by themselves, but I'd say these are all ones that I think have a level of force roughly on the level of the problem of evil.
Okay. So first up, we have psychophysical harmony, and this is based on a paper by Dustin Crummett and Brian Cutter. I think I have read that paper. It's been a while though; it's not fresh on the brain. So go ahead and tell me about this argument.
So the argument from psychophysical harmony suggests that it points to a surprising and striking fact about the relationship between the mental and the physical, which is that there's a sort of harmonious pairing between the mental and the physical. So it'll be the case that you have some desire, for instance, to move your limbs in various ways, and your limbs do move in that way. You'll have this map of the world that roughly matches the way that things are. And when you think about the sheer range of ways that the mental and the physical could have connected, the overwhelming majority of that would not have produced psychophysical harmony. And the simplest set of connections would not have produced psychophysical harmony. So it would be much simpler for the psychophysical laws to simply make it so that there's a conscious, anytime there's any integrated information, there's a conscious creature that has an experience of a red wall in intensity proportional to the amount of integrated information. That would be a much simpler psychophysical law than what our psychophysical laws are. So in light of this, in light of the fact that the overwhelming majority of psychophysical laws and the simplest psychophysical laws all just, give rise to nothing of value, would just give rise to, random mental chaos where we're not any agents of any important sort interacting in the world, this is surprising on theism. This is easier to see if you think about each of the main, so psychophysical harmony is very improbable and very valuable. Now, this is easier to see if you think about each of the main theories of consciousness. So first consider, suppose you're a dualist epiphenomenalist, where you think consciousness is caused by the physical, it's distinct from the physical, but it doesn't do anything physical. So, conscious states never cause anything. Well, then it's super surprising that you have a kind of that your conscious states match what's going on in the world. Because, the conscious laws could have been anything. They could have produced any match. And so it's surprising that, you have a roughly accurate map of what's going on, that if your conscious states don't cause your limbs to move, it's very surprising that when you have a desire for your limbs to move, the damn things move. Now, you might be an interactionist dualist, where you think that conscious states they are caused by physical things, they're non-physical, and they sometimes cause physical things. So there are some set of causal laws that make it so that when you have a desire for your limbs to move, your limbs move. But then it's still surprising that the conscious states that give rise to the matching physics, like it's surprising that, that the conscious state of me willing my limbs to move causes my limbs to move. So a way to see this is anytime there's a conscious state that precedes a physical state, there are basically three things that happen. First, there's some physical state. Let's call it physical state A, like a state of the brain. That gives rise to some mental state, like, a conscious state where you desire to move your limbs. And then, so let's call that mental state B. And then that gives rise to a third physical state. Let's call that physical state C, that involves you moving your limbs. But the point is, we could swap out B, the intermediate mental state, with any of an infinite range of mental states. And so long as we keep A and C the same, then your behavior would stay the same. So in light of this, it's enormously improbable that the intermediate mental state ends up matching harmoniously with the physical in a way when it just doesn't have to, and there's no reason to think in principle that it must. Now,
wait. So are you saying that it's an amazing coincidence that pain repels me from something and pleasure attracts me? That's like an amazing coincidence that we.
So when you talk about repels and attracts, the terms repel and attract are ambiguous. So it's not at all surprising that when you feel pain, you have a desire for your to stop whatever it is that's causing you pain. What is surprising is that your body behaviorally responds by moving away from the thing that's in pain.
That just doesn't seem very surprising to me. Why should I find that surprising?
Well, the overwhelming majority of psychophysical laws would not have produced that, and all of the simplest psychophysical laws would not have produced that. But
when you say the overwhelming majority, you mean everything logically conceivable being treated as a genuine possibility?
Yeah, any conceivable psychophysical law. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not convinced that those are all genuine metaphysical possibilities. Just because they're imaginable doesn't mean it's like they're genuinely possible.
So even if they're not genuinely possible, I think it's conceivable worlds that fit into the epistemic. Like, even if something is not possible, it can, on your theory, it can still be surprising that it's impossible. So even if you let's see this with physicalism. So the third way to go, you could be a physicalist where you think that consciousness is no different from a physical state. Now there are different versions of this, but the kind of standard version of physicalism, thinks that there's a conceptual distinction between the mental and the physical, but just thinks they're in fact the same thing. So just as our concept of water and H2O are different, but water just is H2O, they kind of think that about consciousness. So it's true that on that theory, it would be necessary that consciousness is psychophysically harmonious. But some fact can be necessary and still can be very surprising, right? So the fact that the mental states and the physical states pair up, it's claimed, even if that's necessary, it's still very surprising. For example, if you had a theory, imagine the initial conditions of the universe spelled out, made by God with love in every human language. And that would probably be, that would be very surprising. On atheism. But you could always say, it's just necessary. Okay, but the point is, even if it's necessary, it's surprising that that's necessary rather than something else, when there are other sort of conceivably equally good candidates for being necessary. So with psychophysical harmony, even if you're a physicalist and you think that whichever states are actual will end up being necessary, it's surprising that the ones that happen to be actual, the necessary connections are super valuable. They'd still be surprising even if necessary. So an analogy that I heard, I think Brian Cutter give is, imagine that you came across some island and you weren't sure if the rocks on the island were movable. But then you see them arranged in all these very rich and complicated patterns that seem indicative of human design. Well, then you should say, well, because they're in a way arranged in a way that's improbable and valuable, I assume that I now infer, one, they are movable. I infer the conjunction of the claim. They're movable and they have been moved. And so similarly, if you see the psychophysical connections are super improbable and valuable, then you infer the conjunction, well, the psychophysical laws are super valuable and have been sort of changed so that great value was in fact brought about. So yeah, that's the basic thing to say about psychophysical harmony.
So that actually, what you were saying there sounds like it could also have been used as a rebuttal to some common objections to the fine-tuning argument, which is the next one on your list, also S tier. So why don't you go ahead and explain that one?
Sure. So the argument from fine-tuning says, so there are kind of, I think, a few different slightly distinct considerations that are lumped under the category of fine-tuning. So one of them is there's a striking observation that has been made by physicists, which is that various parameters in physics, various constants, which are the values that go into the physical equations, are finely tuned in the following sense. If they were different by even a very small amount, no interesting structures could arise. So with the cosmological constant, for instance, of the values that it could take on, only about 1 part in 10 to the 120th of those values would give rise to any complex structures of any sort. So that's the kind of fine-tuning in physics. There's also a more basic conceptual point, which is that just of all the ways you could imagine the laws being, the vast majority of them wouldn't produce anything interesting. The simplest laws would just result, maybe in everything moving in a circle or going in a straight line or something. And so it's very surprising that we get laws that are capable of giving rise to any complex structures, and then the constants that go into these laws happen to fall in this very narrow range where they give rise to the formation of complex structures. So overall, I think both of these facts are surprising, and certainly, much more expected on theism than on atheism.
So doubtless you are familiar with Matt Lutz's response to this and his blog, Human Being. I saw that you commented on that. So basically his response is to say sort of what I was saying with response to the psychophysical harmony argument, which is, wait, you're treating all of these things as genuine possibilities. You're treating every single number for how strong one of the constants is as a genuine way things might have been. But surely the atheist is going to say that the basic laws of nature simply are, they're simply necessary, and they could not have been otherwise. To treat it as a huge coincidence is to treat something that is necessary as if it were contingent.
Yeah. Well, so I don't think this is right. I mean, so imagine that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out, made by God with love in every human language. That would be strong evidence for theism. We could always say, well, on the atheist picture, we think that the initial conditions are necessary, and so they couldn't be anything else. But the point is, if there are a whole range of values you could imagine something taking on, and it happens to take on one of the values, the probability of that is always going to be very low. And so it's still surprising that it took on that particular value, even if it's necessary. Similarly, even though if the digits of pi are, whatever the digits of pi are is necessary, okay? But if the millionth through 2 millionth digits of pi were just all the number 1, just back to back, that would be pretty surprising. A fact can be both surprising and necessary. So if there was one theory that required every theory between a million and 2 million to be 1 in pi, and the other one didn't, well, that would be a defect of the first theory.
What do you say to the multiverse response, which is to say, okay, so let's say it's super surprising. Well, it's not all that surprising if every single physically possible arrangement is realized in some possible universe. Of course, we're in the one that has life in it or we're in one of the ones that has life. Like, where else would we be? We're not going to be in one of the ones that doesn't have life in it. Once you think of it in that terms, it starts to seem just sort of mundane, right? Sure, if every possible permutation is realized, that will include ones with life in them. And of course, that's where we have to be. So no mystery here.
Yeah, so I agree that the multiverse, I think it's the most plausible atheistic explanation of fine-tuning. But nonetheless, the multiverse, I think, is plagued with problems. The first one is that even though it will explain the fine-tuning in physics, it won't explain the kind of conceptual fine-tuning. So in order for the multiverse hypothesis to not be a horrendously improbable hypothesis, you'll have to think that you don't want to say that there are, Google-plex different universes for no reason. So to their credit, that's why physicists will propose multiverse models where there's some single simple process that generates many different universes. But then the point is that the probability of there being a process that generates many universes is much higher given theism than given atheism. Like imagine, you came across a thing of bread on the table and someone says, oh, probably someone baked it. The reply is, no, someone didn't bake it. There was a machine that made bread. Okay, well, who made the machine? That doesn't remove the need for an agent in the first place. And so I think it kicks fine-tuning back a level. Second of all, various multiverse models raise problems with infinity. So it's very difficult to calculate probabilities involving observers in an infinite universe if there are infinite observers with every property. Various multiverse models, therefore, just seem to break down probabilities. I think it'll depend on the precise detail of the multiverse model, but that's at least another constraint on it. Third, one thing Robin Collins has argued is that there isn't just fine-tuning in physics for life, but there's also fine-tuning for discoverability. So what he says is that there are certain constants that fall into narrow parameters that are needed for us to discover the universe. So for instance, our ability to discover facts about the early universe will depend on the baryon to photon ratio. It's about 1 billion to 1. And the billion to 1 ratio happens to basically maximize the value of the cosmic microwave background radiation, which allows us to discover the universe better. So he claims that there's just inconceivably improbable fine-tuning for us to be able to do science. And the multiverse wouldn't help there because we could have found ourselves in worlds where we couldn't do science. Okay, so that's the third problem with the multiverse. A fourth problem with the multiverse is it's known as the Boltzmann brain problem. So there's a worry that multiverse models seem to, by default, produce mostly Boltzmann brains. Boltzmann brains are brains that randomly and briefly fluctuate into existence for a few seconds in outer space before falling out of existence. So, Boltzmann brains are, it would be quite a shame if we were, it would be if we're Boltzmann brains that totally, fucks with our ability to have any rational beliefs, because we're just this thing that randomly fluctuates into existence, and there's no reason to trust our beliefs. Now, on the Boltzmann brain, so multiverses seem to produce mostly Boltzmann brains by default for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that even non-finely tuned worlds can produce Boltzmann brains. And so just by, random stuff coming together. So because there are so many more non-finely tuned universes than finely tuned universes, you can still get a ton of Boltzmann brains. Another reason is that if entropy grows over time, entropy is like how much, disorder there is in a system. Eventually you'll get just this really high entropy state that will last forever. And it'll continually produce Boltzmann brains, but it'll no longer be capable of producing with any but utterly inconceivably low probability non-Boltzmann brain states. So there's the Boltzmann brain problem. There's the discoverability problem. There's the problem of kicking back, fine-tuning, and then there's the fact that there are problems with the measure problem of just the probability of getting of how we can do probabilistic reasoning in the absence. Then one point is just that even if the multiverse can explain it, you can always explain some data. Okay, the question is just what the relative probabilities are, and I don't know. It seems weird how infrequently in the discussion it's discussed what the probability is of the multiverse rather than if the multiverse can't explain it. If a multiverse is low probability on atheism, then it's evidence for theism. And then lastly, I think even if we discover that there is a multiverse, well, I think if there's a multiverse would be evidence for theism, because a multiverse is really valuable. If God has the ability to create, you wouldn't expect him to just do a little bit of creating. You'd expect him to do lots and lots of different acts of creation. Oh, and sorry, the last point about the multiverse, and this one's I think pretty important, not all multiverse models will get you a finely tuned universe. What you need is not merely a bunch of different universes. You need to have different universes that vary the constants, that vary the laws across the universes, because you need some universe. There's also fine tuning in the laws. If you deleted any of the laws, there would be no life. And then you also need fine-tuning of the initial conditions. So you need to get some multiverse, generates a bunch of different universes, doesn't produce too many Boltzmann brains, doesn't break down probability, changes the law of constants initial conditions, is compatible with fine-tuning for discoverability. And then even if you have that, well, that's, the multiverse is evidence for theism, because it's more likely there'd be a multiverse given theism than given atheism. So overall, I think the multiverse is the best response the atheists have. It's the least implausible explanation of fine-tuning, but still, it's not super probable.
Well, so as far as the probability of there being a multiverse, I guess there are people who understand quantum mechanics a whole lot better than I do, like Sean Carroll and David Deutsch, who think that the multiple universes interpretation is the best thing going. And in fact, David Deutsch thinks it's not even an interpretation of quantum mechanics. This is just what quantum mechanics tells us. So people who subscribe to that view, positing a multiverse isn't some ad hoc thing that's meant to get us out of the fine-tuning argument or something.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, first of all, the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, that what will get you many universes, it gets you many universes with the same laws of physics. So it doesn't help you with fine-tuning. And there are also deep questions about how measuring the number of observers with different properties on that view. But even putting that aside, right, so I agree, I think there probably is a multiverse, but I just think the probability of a multiverse merely given atheism is low. And so even if our best science points to X, our best science also points to, the constants that we in fact have. But that doesn't mean it's not evidence for theism. It can be both evidence for theism and some fact that's attested to us by our best scientific theories.
Okay, wait, but I think you're changing horses there, aren't you? Because if you say, yes, a multiverse could explain the apparent fine-tuning, but a multiverse is evidence for God, you're just swapping in the fine-tuning argument for the multiverse is evidence for God's existence, right? Isn't that what you're doing?
Well, so what I think is that a multiverse, like a mere multiverse, would be some evidence for God's existence, but it wouldn't be that decisive.
So you're going to say we need not just a multiverse, but a multiverse that contains fine-tuning. But really, that just requires one possible permutation of matter that includes us. That's all we need. That's all we really need. So that doesn't seem so far-fetched to me.
Well, I think it is far-fetched when you realize that to get a permutation of matter that's like us, you need to have a multiverse that varies the laws, constants, and initial conditions, that accounts for fine-tuning for discoverability. You need to have a multiverse in the first place, which is unlikely given atheism. You need to have it avoid the Boltzmann brain problem. You need to have it not mess with our probabilities. And even then, I think, a multiverse is pretty, it's very expected given theism, but not very expected given atheism. And so even if you somehow avoid all those problems, it's still evidence for theism. Like even if we discovered that solving the Boltzmann brain problem is trivial, that a sizable portion of initial worlds get a multiverse, that there's no fine-tuning for discoverability and so on, like a multiverse is still just like super expected given theism and a bit surprising given atheism. And so it would still be evidence for theism, even putting all the rest of the things aside. So yeah, so I think a multiverse of the right kind is quite thoroughly unlikely, because there are many different steps that you have to go through, none of which are very likely. And so the conjunctive probability of getting through all of them is pretty low.
So that brings us to your favorite argument, your argument bestie, the anthropic argument, which you have, I think, a published paper on, right?
No, I don't, sadly. I have a published paper on the self-indication assumption, which is relevant to the anthropic argument.
Right.
It's one of the premises in the anthropic argument.
All right.
Yeah.
So tell us about the anthropic argument and how the self-indicating assumption factors into it.
Okay, so the self-indication assumption is... So anthropics is just broadly the field of philosophy that's about how to do probabilistic reasoning about your own existence. So think about a sample case. A coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person's created. And if it comes up tails, 10 people are created. Suppose that you get created from this process. Now, and then ask, what are the odds that the coin came up heads? There are two basic kinds of answers. The first kind is that it would say that heads and tails are equally likely, where the idea is that whether it came of heads or tails, you're guaranteed to exist. The second kind of answer is that tails is 10 times likelier than heads, where the idea there is that if 10 times as many people come to exist, then the odds that you would come to exist are 10 times higher. So the self-indication assumption is basically the second view. It says that theories on which there are X times as many people who are candidates for being your current self, who you might presently be, make your present existence X times as likely. Now, the self-indication assumption, I think, is very plausible. I think there are many powerful arguments for it, some of which I give in the published paper. But suppose we grant the self-indication assumption. Well, if a theory in which there are 10 times as many people makes our existence 10 times likelier, and a theory in which there are 1,000 times as many people makes your existence 1,000 times likelier, a theory in which there are infinitely many people makes your existence infinitely likelier. But this doesn't just stop at infinity. It turns out that there are larger and smaller infinities. And so really what this will show is that whatever the biggest number of infinity is, whatever the biggest infinity is that corresponds to the number of possible people, that's how many people you should think there are. Because it's infinitely likely than any other alternative, unless that many people exists. 0% of possible people exist. But if 0% of possible people exist, it's very surprising that you're one of the lucky 0%. So the core idea is, so from the self-indication assumption, your existence is X times likelier if there are X times as many people. If that's right, you should think the number of people is the maximum number that there could be. And then theism is the best explanation of that. If there is a God, it's at least not super unlikely that you'd get some stupendously large number of people. It's plausibly good to create. And so God would do just and God has no limits on how much he'd create. So maybe he'd do no creating at all, but if he does create, he'd create just an unfathomable amount of good stuff. So the odds of there being the maximum number of people that there could be, given theism, are pretty high. In contrast, given atheism, the odds of there being the maximum number of people that there could be seems super low. The number of people that's possible, a very minimal lower bound on it, is a number called Beth2, which is more than the number of numbers, not just 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., more than the number of real numbers, which include all the infinite non-repeating decimals. In order to get that many people, you need an extraordinarily weird universe and an extraordinary degree of gerrymandering. Now, such a reality is positively expected given theism for the reasons I described. But given atheism, it's very unlikely and bizarre, and the ways that atheism tends to get it will tend to collapse induction. So I think the argument is pretty smooth sailing if you accept the self-indication assumption. The question is, of course, why the hell would anyone accept the self-indication assumption? Or sorry.
Wait. Let's stop there and sort of unpack this. So, is it the case then that is it a problem for your view that there are only 8 billion people in the world and like 120 billion people who've ever lived, and as opposed to zillions and zillions and zillions? Like, shouldn't we be expecting way more people than there are, given this idea that theism predicts a lot of people?
Well, so I think that, yeah, if the argument's right, you should think there are lots of people, but there's no reason to think all the people that there are would have to be here on Earth. So I think you should think that God makes a giant multiverse.
What about elsewhere in this universe? Like, do you think that the discovery of intelligent extraterrestrial life would be evidence for theism?
I think it would be a bit of evidence. I don't think it's super decisive, but maybe it would slightly raise the probability. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of extra life in this universe, but there's also lots of life in other universes, because there can only be at most Aleph null people in this universe, and there are many more than Aleph null possible people. So you can't get every possible person would not fit here.
Okay, so as for the self-indicating assumption, I wonder, could we use this to refute solipsism? So like the view that I am the only conscious being, everyone else is like a projection of my imagination or something. I imagined you as like I needed a really good interlocutor or something. Like, could we say like, wait, that's really implausible, because like of all of the apparently 8 billion people in the world, they're all zombies. You're the one conscious person. Isn't it more likely that, everybody's conscious, because then there's, much more chances that you would be one of those people?
Yeah, one nice feature of the self-indication assumption is that it makes solipsism very unlikely. If there's just one person who exists, What are the odds it would happen to be you? And in fact, I think the non-self-indication assumption views kind of both like imply skepticism with high probability. Its main rival is called the self-sampling assumption, which says you should see yourself as kind of like randomly selected from among the people that exist. But if there are 8 billion, if there are 110 billion people who have ever lived, the odds of me having my properties rather than one of theirs are super low. So on the self-indication assumption, you get a roughly 100 billion to 1 update in favor of solipsism. While on the self-indication assumption, you're at solipsism. So that's a major point in favor of SIA.
Is that one of the arguments in favor of it that you discuss in your paper?
I don't think I discussed that argument in my paper, but yeah, I think that that's a nice feature of it. And certainly it's a problem with some of the alternatives.
So what do you think are the best arguments in favor of the self-indication assumption?
So the best arguments in favor of the self-indication assumption, I mean, there are quite a few that I think are pretty good. But so let me just describe kind of like a core intuition behind the self-indication assumption that I think will not just give an argument for the self-indication assumption, but will help you intuitively understand why the self-indication assumption is correct. So let's think of a very simple case. One person's created, and then coins flipped. If it comes up heads, no other people get created. If it comes up tails, one other person gets created. So suppose you get created, but you don't know if you're the first person or the second person, and ask, what are the odds that the coin that's flipped comes up heads? And I use the phrase comes up because you don't know if it's already come up or if it will come up in the future, because you don't know if you're the second person or the first person. Well, the self-indication assumption would say the odds are 2/3. After all, there are twice as, if it comes up tails, there are twice as many people as if it comes up heads. So you should think at 2/3 odds it comes up heads. This may seem weird to think that that your credence in a coin coming up tails is 2/3, but sometimes it is if you have special evidence that it came up tails, and that's what the self-indication assumption says. Like if I see a coin came up tails, I'm very confident that it came up tails because I even though coins come up heads half the time, I know that one didn't. So the coin is after being created, you should think it came up tails. Okay, but why I think this is correct? Well, so here the basic argument is the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. So if you learned that you were the first person, you should think there's a 50% chance that the coin will come up heads. Okay, so odds you're the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. That seems straightforward enough. But then the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails equals the odds that you're the second person and the coin has come up tails. After all, if you know the coin came up tails, you being the first person is just as likely as you being the second person. And so when you conjoin these factors, you have 3 equally likely events. One of them involves the coin having come up heads, and one of them involves the coin having come up tails. And so overall, you think that the scenarios where the coin comes up tails are just, there are 2 of them. There's only one where it comes up heads. These are the only options. And so the odds of the coin having come up tails is twice as high as the odds of the coin coming up heads. So that's sort of a straightforward illustrative case. So now let's see what happens if you don't adopt the self-indication assumption. So let's say you think, so you're created and you think you reject the self-indication assumption and you think it's equally likely that the coin comes up heads and that the coin comes up tails. And then you're told you're the first person. Well, on the theory that the coin comes up tails, you could have been either of the 2 people. So the odds you would be the first person is only 50%. In contrast, on the theory on which the coin comes up heads, there's only one person, so you had to be the first person. And so you being the first person has a 100% probability. So you previously thought the coin coming up heads and tails were equally likely. Then you learn something that's guaranteed if the coin comes up heads, but only 50% likely if the coin comes up tails. And so when you combine those, you learn something that's twice as likely if the coin comes up heads and tails. And you previously thought they were equally likely. If there's a theory that has a 50% probability, and then you get evidence that's twice as likely if it's true than false, then you should think it's true at 2/3 odds. So now you should think at 2/3 odds that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads. Even though you know it's fair, you know it hasn't been flipped, just based on what will happen if the coin comes up heads. If you change what would happen if the coin would come up heads, then it would stop. Then the probability of it coming up heads would change. If it wouldn't make a person, then the probability would change. That seems super bizarre. It's like, why in the world, if it's a fair coin and I haven't flipped it yet, why should my credence in it coming up heads be anything other than 50%? So if you accept Bayesian reasoning, then you inevitably either have to think that your credence in a fair coin coming up heads that hasn't been flipped yet is more than 50%, or you have to think that, or you have to be accept a self-indication assumption. Now, even if you reject Bayesian reasoning, there's still a version of this result that you're committed to. So still, there's a case where you end up having to think at 5/8 odds. The odds that a fair coin will come up heads are 5/8. But yeah, I mean, so in any case, just so long as you think that if there's a fair coin and it hasn't been flipped yet, you just think there's a 50% chance it'll come up heads, you basically have to accept the self-indication assumption. So that's one argument I regard as very strong. Another argument that's a little bit simpler is, so think about a simple case. A coin's flipped. If it comes up heads, one person's created. If it comes up tails, 1 million people are created. Suppose that you get created from this process. SIAers will think that you should think tails is 1 million times likelier than heads. Non-SIers will think that you should think heads and tails are equally likely. Now let's imagine this coin keeps getting flipped every 1,000,000 years. So every 1,000,000 years they flip the coin. They just keep repeating this experiment since the Big Bang. So it's been flipped, 1,400 times roughly. Now the question is, what odds should you give to the coin that created you having come up tails? Well, it seems like the answer is you should think that at roughly 1,000,000 to 1 odds that it came up tails. After all, for every person who's created by heads coin flips, there are 1,000,000 people roughly who are created by tails coin flips. So the non-SIA views imply that if you want to figure out the odds that a coin is flipped 5 minutes ago that created 1 person of heads and 1,000,000 people of tails, it's relevant to figure out if people were doing similar things before the time of the dinosaurs. Okay, but that's ridiculous. If you want to figure out if a coin came up heads, you don't need to know what was happening in the distant past or in other galaxies or in spatiotemporally disconnected worlds. That's utterly irrelevant. And so for that reason, the self-indication assumption is the only view that's compatible with the odds that a coin is flipped 5 minutes ago, thinking that they came up heads, if it created 1 person of heads and 1,000,000 of tails, won't depend on what was happening millions of years in the past. There are many other arguments for the self-indication assumption. I have some blog posts going through like 30 of them or something. I mean, they're not all great. If you have 30 arguments for anything, they won't all be great, but they were all at least good enough to include. So yeah, I think there are many different converging lines of evidence for the self-indication assumption. Each of the points I've so far made, there's a lot more to say about them. I discuss these more in my article, The Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument. So if you want to hear more about it, I'd recommend reading that.
Okay. I just have a thought experiment that I think is grist for you, Emil. I've given you part of this. So like imagine God tells you, either I've created only 10 conscious beings and the rest are zombies, or I've created all conscious beings, but all humans are conscious and 10 are zombies. Okay. So you're conscious. Okay. Which one would be more likely? And so intuitively, it seems like the one where there are only 10 zombies and the rest of the 8 billion humans on Earth, seems like that's the thing you should think is more likely. You're more likely to be a non-zombie in that case. Now you could imagine pairing this with with some decision theory stuff. So imagine there are 2 doors. One of them goes to heaven. One of them goes to hell. You can go through one of these doors. And God says okay, if I created only 10 non-zombie humans, then it's the left door. And if I created, only 10 of them are only 10 humans are zombies and the rest are conscious, then it's the right door goes to heaven. Which one seems like you should go through the right door, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I am finding the self-indication. I keep calling it self-indicating, self-indication assumption. I keep interchanging those, whichever it is. I guess I find that plausible. It's an interesting argument. I don't know that I have any more reply to give to it at the moment. Any objections you want to consider?
I mean, I think the objections are all kind of lame. I mean, the objections are kind of all over the place, but everyone agree. Very few people think the argument works, but if you ask them what's wrong with the argument, I mean, Like they just say wildly different things. So, a common thing is people say, oh, that you exist isn't evidence for anything. Okay, but that's obviously wrong. That you exist is evidence that your parents had sex, for example. It's evidence that they didn't use contraception and so on. People say, they'll say, why doesn't this argument imply that you should think that there are infinite tables? If you see a table, well, the odds of that table existing are higher if there are more tables. Now, it's true that the odds of that particular table existing are higher if there are more tables, but if there are more tables and you only see one table, the odds of that table existing and you seeing it aren't any higher. And so the probabilities cancel out and you don't get any update in favor of theories on which there are, spaces just filled with random tables. Now, you should think that there are infinite tables just because you think there are infinite people who are subjectively like you, and you have experience of tables. You should think they do as well. So you should think there are infinite tables, but you shouldn't think that SIA gives you reason to believe theories on which space is just tiled with tables. One thing people say in response to the argument, they like to say, would God create? But even if you think God wouldn't create, so long as you think that conditional on God creating, you'd be likely to do a lot of creating. The argument still works. It'll still be the case that you get a big update from the self-indication assumption. I think really the way to go if you want to resist the argument is to reject the self-indication assumption. I don't think that's very plausible because I think there are extremely strong arguments for the self-indication assumption. And I think even putting aside the fact that there are extremely strong arguments for the self-indication assumption, there is I think there's a version of the argument that can work on each of the alternatives.
Maybe this is a way you could resist the argument. You could keep the self-indicating assumption or self-indication assumption, and you could adopt an atheist multiverse that also posits, gazillions and gazillions of people. But then we're just back to the stuff that you said in response to the multiverse response to the fine-tuning argument, that the right kind of multiverse is unlikely and that kind of thing. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, in the infinite case, it's especially bad because what you need is a multiverse. You need a multiverse that's really mind-bogglingly large that contains more people than there are numbers. That's not what you would naturally expect on atheism. I think, and this gets in more complicated issues, but I think any mathematically describable multiverse will inevitably be too small. So long as you think there's a set of all universes. I don't think there's a set of all possible people. But right, so you can always posit some explanation of the data, but the point is it's so unlikely on atheism. And the other point is that if there is an infinite multiverse, this probably undermines induction in most cases because there will be infinite deceived people and infinite non-deceived people. Now, this isn't always a problem. So if there are infinite deceived people, but every particular person is unlikely to be deceived, then you can trust the reliability of your cognitive faculties. So, for instance, suppose that you're in Hilbert's Hotel, everyone rolls dice. There are going to be infinite people who get 1 through 5 and infinite people who get 6. And there aren't actually more people who get 6 than 1 through 5. There are infinite people of the same cardinality of both. But nonetheless, you should think at 5/6 odds that you will get 6, that you will get 1 through 5 rather than 6, because some specific process happened to you that made it likely that you would get 1 through 5. So I think similarly, a theist can say, well, for every particular person, God places them in a world ideal for their flourishing, which makes it likely that they wouldn't be deceived. In contrast, on naturalistic multiverse of the right size, it's hard to see how you don't end up getting just infinite deceived people, where it's not the case that for every particular person they're unlikely to be deceived. So I think a naturalistic multiverse model is just what will most that has the right properties will most likely undermine induction.
Interesting. All right, that completes your list. Any final thoughts on this 2-part series?
No, thanks for doing this. Hopefully, I mean, there were a lot of arguments there were some arguments that were on the list that we didn't talk about. So if you want to hear about those arguments, you can also check out the list. If you want to hear more,
I'll include a link on the show description.
Yeah, and if you want to hear more about the argument, the anthropic argument, you can go to the Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument, which is an article on my blog. and hear more about that. But yeah, I don't have too much more to say about it. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this, Spencer. This has been fun discussing the arguments. Yeah.
And that Substack is Bentham's Bulldog. You can Google that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a wrap.